You hear me? Yeah. First and foremost, I wish to thank the organizers of this conference for their exquisite organization, and I know firsthand how hard this can be, and for letting me present to you the topic of my ongoing work in progress. Before we get going, let me share with you a short story that a well-known professor shared with me when he heard that I'm writing my master thesis about Raphael Mahler and his polemics and the polemics surrounding his figure. A funny, sad story, if you wish. He recalls a meeting of the editorial board of Zion Journal, the home court of the Jerusalem School of History, in the early 1970s. Chief editors at the time were prominent historians such as Shmuel Ettinger, Yitzhak Ber, Chaim Hillel ben Sasson. They were going through the big brown envelopes with the articles sent to them for publication, and then they got an article that Raphael Mahler, by that time a veteran and accomplished professor at Tel Aviv University, sent them. Ettinger picked up the envelope, didn't even open it, and just threw it over to the pile of articles not to be read at all. When the young scholar who told me the story, now an emeritus professor, asked them if they didn't want to see what the article was about, Ettinger and the others said something like, "Mahler has been writing the same thing for half a century now. We've already heard what he wants to say." You could perceive this as just another scene from the Israeli film Harat Shulaim, Footnote, and dismiss it as pure academic rivalry. But this small anecdote, I believe, is more than just that, and I will talk further about that. My talk will concentrate on a particular case, Raphael Mahler, and also the group of young historians in interwar Poland. Some of them were already mentioned yesterday in Boaz's talk. However, it's not just the case of Raphael Mahler. It relates to a wider phenomenon which we have heard of in other talks as well. Also yesterday, Dr. Asaf Yedidia mentioned Graetz and the criticism against him. And actually, Mahler is a similar story, if you wish. One was an Orthodox Jew criticized for that, and you can say the other was an Orthodox Marxist criticized for that. And truth be told, we might be even dealing with this ourselves as scholars of different stages and people who are also active in the public sphere in different places. Raphael Mahler, born in Novi Sanz in 1899, a small town in the district of Krakow, West Galicia, which is better known to many of us as Tzanz, the bedrock of Hasidut Tzanz. Growing up in that town, he received traditional education, cheder, young yeshiva, up to the age of 15. As a teenager, he already began his public activity as the local leader of the Zionist student organization Bnei Zion in town. Later on, he went to study in a gymnasium in Krakow, from which he graduated at the age of 18. And then he moved to Vienna University, where he studied history and philosophy and received his PhD in 1922, at the age of 23. His dissertation topic was the sociological problems of progress. After finishing his PhD in Vienna, Mahler found himself in a situation some of us here might relate to. He was a young scholar, ambitious and eager to continue his research, but no institution was waiting for him in open arms. Of course, I am exaggerating and also being a little anachronistic because an academic career was not always a real option for these young scholars, so they would not really be anticipating it. Mahler and his young fellow scholars couldn't even dream of the possibilities a young scholar has today, even in rough times like today of financial troubles in the different humanities faculties. Mahler moved back to Poland, the newly established Second Republic, first to Lodz, then to Warsaw, and then where he, like many of his young friends, started a career as a teacher in various secondary schools. In this period, he also joined the left wing of Poalei Zion Small, and quickly became a member of the party's central committee. When we examine this today in our eyes, we might get the feeling that these young promising scholars had to make a sacrifice in teaching boys and girls and teenagers, and that due to political restrictions and financial circumstances, they had to compromise and couldn't fulfill their full potential as scholars. Though that is true that financial and political circumstances played a role, and when do they not play a role, a claim that they made a sacrifice that led them to frustration might be anachronistic as well. I emphasize this because of the certain similarity to our era, where many young scholars are moving on to teaching in schools because they need to make a living, but they feel that they should be researchers instead. Mahler did not see this being a teacher as lesser respect, as he found great joy and meaning in teaching history, economy, philosophy in different schools. Mahler and his group of friends, among them, already mentioned in the talks yesterday, of course, Emanuel Ringelblum, who was his childhood friend, Bella Mandelsberg, Philipp Friedman, Arthur Eisenbach, Zomber Lippmann, just to name a few, were part of a group that felt that in that day and era, Jewish historians had a mission, a national mission. They believed that the new generation of Jewish historians must be bearers of national and political responsibility, and that the unmediated connection to the masses of teenagers was not a burden for them, but rather an opportunity to educate and possibly recruit them to their party in order to reshape the distorted reality of the Jewish masses. But rises the question, what was the reality that they were asking to restructure, and how did this activist political stance collide, if it collided at all, with their attempt to write down the history of Jews in Eastern Europe? An important factor that should be restated before we get to high resolutions is that Mahler and many of these young historians were prominent figures in Poalei Zion Smol. It wasn't just Mahler, which was very popular in Poland in the 1920s, less so in the 1930s. And as students of Ber Borochov, their activity, political and academic, should be seen in that light. One of the main beliefs Mahler held, more so than the others in this group, was that the use of Yiddish in the public sphere and education of all levels was very crucial. This was one of the focal disputes between Poalei Zion Smol and the mainstream Zionist labor movement in Palestine, which advocated the use of Hebrew. Mahler, loyal to Borochov's notion that Yiddish, the language of the masses, is to be used so the ideas be better proliferated, saw the promotion of scholarly works and projects as one of his main objectives. Mahler and Ringelblum were the founders. Truth be told, Ringelblum founded Junger Historiker Kreis. Mahler joined them a short time after. This was a forum of young scholars that held a weekly seminar in Warsaw, but also gave lectures in front of crowds in factories and social clubs around town, and also in different smaller towns in Poland. They were also involved in several key publications. They believed that forming a strong historic consciousness would provide a cultural shelter to the secular masses, especially to the youth, which had rejected both religious aspects but also assimilation. Mahler believed that the way to form such a consciousness was to revamp Jewish historiography of Eastern Europe, and he wrote that he and his colleagues felt that they were, I quote, the voice of the masses, end quote, and that they are, quote, creating the history from within for the nation and for the masses, end quote. And this is contrary to the Jewish historiography up to their times, which was, quote again, written by Western European historians for a Western European crowd of readers. This is Mahler in his article Dubnovs Theorie wegen der Jiddischer Geschichte, published in Literarische Blätter in 1930. Mahler wrote in a strong conviction that his work was as a historian was not simply a sterile action. He was not just a scientist in a laboratory or an archive. And the introductory article to the first journal that the group published in 1926, called simply Junger Historiker, Mahler stated that it is a necessity to study the history of the Jewish people at this specific point of time, so that this history shall become, I quote, of immediate relevance and give meaning to contemporary Jewry, end quote. This journal was the display window for Mahler and his fellow Junger Historiker, but by no means was this their only voice. Besides writing academic works, books, and articles. They also wrote popular articles in the press, especially in the Arbeiter Zeitung and Freie Jugend, the party's organs. They taught history in secondary schools and in factories and in cafes and workshops and social clubs. And they led also one of the most interesting activities related to the documentation and collection of Jewish history in that period. The Sammlers can be seen as a continuation of what Ansky and Peretz asked the Jews to do, talked about for World War I. Similar to developments in Polish historiography and also European general historiography, the Eyal school in France, for example, the Junger Historiker group put a strong emphasis on social history, what we might call today people's history. This went hand in hand with their belief that Jewish historiography had been ruled up to this point solely by discussions on rabbis, rich families, or what the Goyim did to the Jews. In order to fix these distortions and at the same time bond the masses to their local communities, and by doing so actually creating local social networks, the Evo Historical Section, which gave sponsorship to the Junger Historikerkreis, organized this network of Sammlers. These were private people in small towns that were volunteered to collect documents, books, pinkasim, and any type of material related to the history of the local community. In this way, the new generation of historians, like Mahler and his friends, would have a firm data bank constantly growing that would enable them to write the history of the Jewish communities based on Jewish sources. This contrary to the habit of writing history of the Jews according to foreign ruler documentation. The goal was, and I cite from Samuel Kassov's book that we already talked about, that professional and amateur historians create together a new canon of texts that would help legitimize the project of creating a national secular identity, and also in the meantime to undermine the old notions of Klal Yisrael that is united only by religion and suffer. But this Sammler's project, which indeed brought together documents that helped generations of scholars, still helps us today. Unfortunately, many of them were lost during the Holocaust, also brings us to the point of tension, which is at the heart of my discussion. Mahler, Ringelblum, and their friends wanted these documents to help create real and new vibrant Jewish historiography that be based on scientific rules and standards. They saw themselves as historians that build their thesis, books, art, and articles based on facts, archival documents, primary sources, and so forth. They also saw themselves as political and social activists, but they saw no conflict between these two sides of the coin. They didn't, but others did, and others still do. Mahler was not the only Jewish historian to write from a Marxist materialist point of view, but he was definitely one of the main figures to do so, and more so, he continued doing so long after it was practically considered a sin. He did so, to tell the truth, until his death in Tel Aviv in 1977. Mahler survived the Holocaust because he moved to the United States in 1938, and in 1950 he moved to Israel, where he helped, first he sat in Jerusalem. The local historians did not accept him too well, to say, to minimize it, but he moved to Tel Aviv and was part of the founding group of Tel Aviv University and the humanities faculty over there. He continued to write constantly until his death in 1977, and he continued to stress the need to rewrite Jewish history according to Marxist view, also after the 1950s and 60s. This outlook served as the fundamental approach in his numerous books and articles. We can see this in Mahler's credo, as it is illuminated in the introductory that he wrote for the first volume of his magnum epos, Divrei Yemei Israel, published in 1957. I quote, "Any kind of critical examination of the prevailing philosophies in Jewish historiography will convince us that the philosophy of historical materialism, which sheds light upon the process of development of all humanity, also clarifies the history of our people," end quote. Mahler's adherence to the Marxist philosophical school from his first days as a young scholar, and even more so as this school of thought lost its prestige, made him a target for many critics. Israel Biderman, another Jewish-Polish historian, described Mahler's approach as follows, I quote, "Mahler believes that all the historian needs to do is to supply the proofs for a valid a priori proposition." End quote. But Mahler was not a mere punching bag, and he made his stance loud and clear on different stages and occasions, also confronting with and criticizing the top tier of Jewish historians, live and dead. We are here in a conference commemorating Heinrich Graetz book, and Mahler writes of him in his book, Historiker und Wegweiser, published also in the 60s, that Graetz was a supreme poet of the sage of Jewish heroism, but he was too passionate and too romantic. He also criticizes Dubnov in that book, saying that Dubnov left the fundamental issues of Jewish history unclarified due to his fundamental nationalistic outlook. Mahler answered his critics, got answered by them, but to make matters short, the main argument against him was, and I quote Biderman again, Mahler was more interested in political stance than in historical truth. He has a predetermined proposition and he squeezes the entire course of history into this restrictive framework, which for him is fixed for all the time, end quote. It seems that in the test of time, Mahler, which was one of the leading and promising young historians in interwar Poland, and later on continued his fruitful academic career in New York and Tel Aviv, was in some way brushed away by the historians and the academic community, especially by the Jerusalem School at the Hebrew University. Mahler's critiques have, in a wide sense, yielded success. His figure is remembered today as a Marxist, first of all, and his life's work, which is very wide and very deep, is stained by this image deeply. When I mention to different people and colleagues that I am dealing with Mahler, their first reaction is something like, "Oh yeah, that Marxist historian." I studied history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and we never got to read any of his articles and books. I checked with students in other institutions in Israel and abroad, and they gave me same answers. No one reads Mahler. All right. So here in the Galilee, we read him. A year ago, I accidentally ran into a reading list that Shmuel Ettinger gave his students in an MA course at the Hebrew University in the 1970s, and Mahler's book Hasidut and Haskalah was on that list. I was surprised and happy, and that same day I ran into a professor from our department, and I asked him what he makes out of this. He laughed and he told me that he sat in that class actually, and that he remembers that Ettinger told them to read this book in order to understand how they should not write history. One of the most popular phrases regarding historical research is that history is written by the victors. In that sense, Mahler was not a victor, you could say. And this is true also regarding historiographical trends. Mahler was pushed aside for a long period of time due to his strong materialist beliefs that were unwelcome at different relevant stages and departments. His strong political ties and activities, from his early days in Poalei Zion Small, and later his affiliation with Mapam in Israel, made him somewhat a marginal figure, definitely not hugged by the mainstream of scholars. Though it is worth mentioning that he did win the Israel Prize in 1977, a few months before he passed away, as he was already sick. I believe that the long years that have gone by might wipe away that stain a bit, and that we can learn to appreciate Mahler's monumental body of work, knowing that it needs to be read with a grain of salt, but the truth is that all history should be read like that. On a personal notice, I believe that we can also learn that combining political and social activities beside the scholarly work is not something to be seen as a sin. Thank you.